Welcome, everyone, to a brighter a brighter 6 o'clock than we've seen in a while, right? This used to be a nighttime class, so it's nice to be back in. What is it? Are we daylight not savings or savings? The whole system sucks, right? I don't want to go back and forth. Let's keep it this way. Okay. This is in a sense our last class together. That's not true. We're going to have a class next week, but all of our classes next week we will be kind of linking into the preparation for Passover. So we will have a class, but what we're going to do next week is return to the Song at the Sea, one of the first things that we looked at, and kind of revisit the Song at the Sea, because it is like the Passover poem. So this is the end of, in a sense, at the end of just like the work that we've been doing, moving through biblical poetry, and we've covered a lot of ground. We looked at poetry in the Torah. We looked at poetry in the books of the writings, the books that include Psalms and Proverbs and the books of Solomon. We looked at all of the major prophets, and we've seen a lot of and we've seen a lot of Psalms along the way. That's been in some ways our kind of our refuge. We always go back to the Psalms. I think that what I'm going to do is to we're going to finish these last 2 weeks of studying biblical poetry, and I think what I'll do is start up this poetry class again in the fall, but we'll look instead this time at liturgical poetry from the prayer book. And there's a kind of a through line there, because the prayer book borrows from the book of the Psalms so much that I thought, oh, maybe we should just keep doing Psalms and keep like moving through the book of Psalms. But there's so much to do there, and I actually think that if the next time we take up this series, we're going to kind of break here. We're going to do some specific learning between Passover and Shavuot, and then over the summer things die down a little. I think we'll pick up again in the fall with the poetry of the prayer book. Okay, so that's the plan. Okay, let's say a blessing together to just bring some presence of mind to our learning today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so here's what I want to do. So I said I thought about coming to an end here, and I'm holding next week's class in a different category, because that's going to be about Passover related poetry regardless. So in some way I thought, oh, this is the day, this is the moment where we can kind of bring our this course of our study to an end. And I thought, well, what's the last piece of poetry that I want to look at, where do we end this journey? And I think what I decided would be most fitting is to return to Moses. Moses, in a sense, is kind of like our poet laureate, in Israel, in ancient Israel, because Moses really gives us the first great, grand, epic poem, and that is the Song at the Sea. In our first class, we looked at some of the early poetic formulations in the Torah. A few lines here and there that seem to be poetic. In fact, the first words that a human being utters, I think, in the Torah are poetic words. But it's Moses Moses was so many things, right? Moses was the greatest of all the prophets. Moses was the liberator. Moses was the lawgiver. But I think it's worth, in this space that we've created together, it's worth also thinking of Moses as a poet. Moses was a poet. Our great leader was a poet and composed these works of poetry that, I don't know if the whole, we talked about this before. Some people see the whole of the Torah as a poem, either spiritually or maybe actually every single verse can be broken up into poetic form. but we won't go that far. We'll just say that even if the bulk of the Torah is law or prose, there are these massive poetic sections, and so we have to regard Moses as a poet, as someone who decided to. And I know some of you out there are thinking, well, are we really talking about Moses as the author of the Torah? Is there a historical Moses? But for our purposes, that doesn't. Whoever it is that assembles the Torah together assembles it with some moments of poetry in mind, big moments of poetry, and the biggest ones are Moses's oratory, moments where Moshe, maybe I'll start to call him Moshe. Moshe is it's not God reciting the poem. This is interesting. Moshe's usually the conduit, the mouthpiece of God. But when we get these big blocks of poetry, it's almost distinctly not God speaking. Right? Az yashir Moshe uvnei Yisrael. Then Moses and the children of Israel recited this poem, sung this song before God. And the other kind of great big work of poetry that Moses offers is Parashat Hazinu, one of the last readings of the Torah, which Hazinu Hashamayim va'adaber, listen heavens and I will speak. It's Moses speaking, Moses poetizing, right? Moses singing. So Moses has these moments where he stops all the action and just says, I have to give forth my own voice in poetic form. And that's quite striking. And I want us to think about Moses today as a poet. And I want to look in this sort of last session we have together at Moses's last poem, Moshe's last poem. Because in fact, I just mentioned two great poems that Moshe is known for, the Song of the Sea and then Parashat Hazinu. But the truth is, the very last things that Moshe said to us were in poetic form. And that is the very last reading of the Torah, V'zot HaBracha, which we often skip right over because it doesn't have a week devoted to it. It gets sort of lost in the shuffle of the turning of the cycle and the high holidays. And we read V'zot HaBracha on Simchat Torah, just like, okay, let's finish the Torah right up. So we don't usually read this, and we don't usually read it carefully, but V'zot HaBracha is the last parsha in the Torah. It means, and this is the blessing, V'zot HaBracha. And this is the blessing that Moses blessed the people of Israel with before he died. Okay, and that blessing is one of these sections of the Torah that's very clearly in poetic form, very clearly. Okay, so in some ways, Moshe's got kind of a triad of great poems in the Torah, the Song of the Sea, Parashat Hazinu, and then this last great poem that Moshe offers us. And I want to look at it as a kind of a reflection on the poet laureate of Israel, the person who started, the figure who started for us the poetic tradition in biblical Hebrew. And then also to think about how that voice comes to a close, and what it means about how that life comes to a close, because the Torah ends with Moses's end, with Moses's death, and in that sense, the Torah doesn't end on a happy note, right? And Moshe's life, or Moshe's poetic expression ends with death. So that's the backdrop. That's to keep in mind as we kind of begin to take a look here at the legacy of this first great poet of Israel. So here's what I want to oh my goodness, I'm just looking in the chat, and I'm seeing that one of our members has a brother who's very seriously ill in the hospital. So that's Raymond Yussel Ben Label, Florine's brother, Raymond Rosen. So let's dedicate our learning to the healing of Yussel Ben Label, of Raymond Rosen, and all of those who are in need of healing today. Okay, so here is a source sheet for you. Now, let's just get a little bit of context, and we're just gonna, V'zot HaBracha is the last reading of the Torah. We're gonna kind of just rewind one paragraph just to hear what was happening right before Moses offered this final oratory, this final poem. And actually, this is really critical. The thing that happens right before is going to be important for us to keep in mind as we look at the poem itself. So let's take a look at these last words that Moshe is receiving from God before Moshe says goodbye. So we're going to look at chapter 33. This is chapter 32 of Deuteronomy. There are 34 in all, so we're right near the end here. And Deuteronomy is a book that is like a long speech that Moshe gives. The last sort of great long speech that Moshe gives to the people of Israel before, as the book of Deuteronomy opens, as they stood on the plains of Moab, looking across into the land. They can see the land, but they're not there yet. Okay, and they will cross over, but as you probably already know, Moshe will not go with him, and that's what this paragraph is going to remind us of. So let's take a look. That very day, the Eternal spoke to Moshe, meaning on the very day that Moshe gave this grand oratory and hortatory also to the children of Israel. That very day, God spoke to Moshe, and God said, "Aleh el hare avarim hazeh." Har Navo asher be'eretz Moab. Go up to these mountains, these heights of Avarim, to Mount Navo, which is in the land of Moab facing Jericho, and view the land of Canaan. Go look at the land which I'm giving to the Israelites as a holding. You shall die on the mountain that you are about to ascend, and shall be gathered to your kin, as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor, and was gathered to his kin. For you broke faith with me among the Israelite people at the waters of Merivat Kadesh, in the wilderness of Tzin, by failing to uphold my sanctity among the Israelite people. You may view the land from a distance, but you shall not enter it, the land that I am giving to the Israelite people. Okay. So that's the last message that Moshe gets. That's God's great goodbye to Moshe. Go and look at the land that I'm going to give to the Israelite people, but remember, you're not going into the land because you broke faith with me at Merivat Kadesh. Now, I'm going to remind you, but do folks know, like, what is the Torah referring to? You broke faith with me. You didn't sanctify me. People know. I'm seeing some people nodding heads. Susan, you wanna clue us in?
He hit the stone. Get the
Good.
water out instead of expecting it just to come.
Good. Okay. Now this is going to be important. I promise I'm not going to do all the talking this class, but this is the last thing we really need to set up. And Susan's exactly right. This is a reference to a devastating moment in the Torah's narrative in the book of Numbers, when the people are once again thirsty and once again crying out and angry and complaining is the word that is used. And God tells Moses to speak to a rock, and the rock will produce water. God says this to Moses and Aaron. I don't know if this is. We've grown accustomed to saying, but the problem was that Moshe struck the rock.
Too hard.
Too hard. Yeah. Well, as Susan's already trying to figure out, well, what was actually the problem? Because the point of that story, as we carry it with us, is almost that we don't know what the problem is. Yeah, Moshe struck the rock, but there are a million answers to the question, what was so bad about what Moshe did? Because whatever it was, God said to Moshe and to Aaron, because you did this and you failed to sanctify me, lahakdisheni, to sanctify me in the eyes of the people, you will not enter the land of Israel. It's so, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. This man who devoted his whole life to this mission, to getting the people to the promised land, and did it, will not go because he hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Let me just show this to you for one sec, just so, because you're going to want this scene in your mind, and you're going to want even the name of the places in your mind as we head into our poem today. So if I go to Numbers chapter 20, there they are at the wilderness of Sin, and they're at a place called Kadesh, and the community was without water. By the way, Miriam dies like very quickly there, so that's also there's a lot of heaviness. The community was without water. They came up against Moses and Aaron, and they quarreled. The word for quarreling is vayarev. This will also be important, saying, if we only had perished when our brothers perished at the inside, we should have died. Why have you brought us into the wilderness to die here? Classic Israel. Like, oh my gosh, this wasn't even worth it, right? So fine. Moses and Aaron go to God and they say, what are we going to do with this? And God says, you and your brother Aaron take the rod and assemble the community. And now, first of all, it says take the rod, but it says order the rock to yield its water. Now, I don't want to get into a full analysis of this, but the easiest answer is the one that Susan gave us. The easiest answer to what was wrong is that Moshe took the rod, but he didn't order the water to produce, the rock to produce water. Instead, he said, listen, you rebels, shall we get water from you out of this rock? And he raised his hand and struck the rod twice. Okay. And then the water came out, but the Lord said to Moses, and here's the line, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land I have given them. Okay, imagine that this is the worst moment in Moshe's life, and it's been a hard life. And and the commentators in our tradition, we don't know what to do with it. How could God do this to Moshe? But here's what's important for you to keep in mind is that these are called Mei Meriva, the waters of Meriva, which means quarreling. We saw that word before. The waters of quarreling, meaning that the Israelites quarreled with the Lord. Asher ravu b'nei Yisrael et Adonai vayikadesh bam. Okay, so that scene is, I want you to keep that in mind. And if you weren't, if you weren't thinking of it, God just reminded you of it, right? God just said to Moses, why is this the last thing that God wants to say to Moses? You're not going in the land of Israel because remember, you didn't do this one thing, okay? And that happened at Kadesh, at the Mei Meriva. Okay, now we're ready to head in. Any questions before we go? Okay, so here's what that looks like as it appears in the poem. Now this poem, it's like, you get caught in introductions and then your whole class is introductions. But let me say one more thing. This poem itself is a set of blessings for the tribes of Israel. And in that way, it is already, the poem's already doing something with the language of the Torah, right? This is an echo of an earlier poem in the Torah, right? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Jacob at the end of Genesis blessed all of his sons and did it in poetic form. So Moses, even in doing this, is, I don't know how to say it, but he's doing a thing. Like this poem is a kind of a callback to an earlier poem. It's Moses doing Jacob, but now Jacob was doing it to his sons. Moses is now doing it to these fully grown tribes. Okay, so the poem itself has a kind of a reference built into it. And if we had more time, what we would do is we would go through each of the poems and look at all of we'd analyze them fully and all of the ways that they are different. But we're just going to look at a couple of sections of this later poem, and we will do a little comparative work. But just so you know, Moshe, this is like Jacob's blessing part 2, Moses's addition. Okay. All right. Let's actually take a look at some of this poetry lest I ramble for an hour straight. Okay, here we go. Okay, the Zota Bracha, this is the new, right after this. You didn't sanctify me at Merivat Kadesh, so you're not going into the land. Now, new Parsha. This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the Israelites before he died. And he said, and here comes the poetry, and it is beautiful poetry. I wouldn't just choose it because of its significance. It's very beautiful language. Okay, let's see it. The Eternal came from Sinai and shone upon them from Seir, and appeared from Mount Paran, and approached from Revivot Kodesh, with a fiery law for them at the right hand. Adonai mi Sinai ba, v'zarach mi Seir lamo, hofia mehar Paran, va'ata mirivavot Kodesh, mimino eshdat lamo. Yet a lover of the people. All their holy ones are in your hand, and they followed in your steps, carried your words with them. Af chovev amim, kol kedoshav biyadecha, vehem tukur leraglecha, yisa midabrotecha. Moshe commanded us a Torah as the heritage of the congregation of Jacob. Torah tziva lanu Moshe, morasha kehilat Yaakov. Then there was a king in Jeshurun, when the heads of the people assembled, the tribes of Israel together. Vayhi bishurun melech behitasef roshei am yachad shiftei Israel. Okay, that's the opening. That's just the opening. Then you're going to see Moses click through the various tribes. But let's not go there yet. We'll soon see Reuben and Judah and et cetera, But let's just look at this introduction. And first, let's just look at this first, let's say, stanza, because it's a famous one, but it is, I would say, like almost incomprehensible. This commentators have struggled so much with what exactly is going on here. Okay, first of all, I'm about to open it up to the group, so I hope someone's got some analysis of this. The Eternal came from Sinai. Okay, now the Eternal revealed at Sinai, but did the Eternal come from Sinai? Like, what does that mean? And shone upon them from Seir and appeared from Mount Paran. There's a kind of repetitive language here. Now, Sier and Paran, why are those names significant? Anyone know? Sier and Paran are, as a couple of references, they ring very strongly in the biblical ear. Anyone? Seir is the land of Esau. Seir is the land of Esau, Jacob's brother who does not inherit the covenant. Paran is the land of Ishmael. Paran is the land of Ishmael, who also does not appear in the covenant. So God came from Sinai, but also shined on Seir and also appeared at Paran. So like Israel, Jacob, but also Esau and also Ishmael, right? So what's going on there? And we can talk a little bit about how some of the traditional commentaries address that, but we've got to figure out, what is God doing, like circling around Sinai, us, Esau, Ishmael, right, etc. And then if that weren't weird enough, look at the last place that God is hovering around. And approached from Revivot Kodesh. Now, that also seems like a name. There's Paran, Seir, Sinai, and Revivot Kodesh. But Revivot Kodesh is not a place we know. It literally means the legions of the holy, the thousands of the holy. Okay, that's a nice name, but doesn't seem to mean anything. But does it look familiar to you? It should, because we just looked at a very similar name, Merivat Kadesh, the place where Moses hit the rock. Okay? So there's a little bit of a play on Merivat Kadesh with Revivot Kodesh. And then just finally, and I know this is complicated, but let's just speak out everything that's in this first stanza, with a fiery law for them at the right hand. Now, this word, Eshdat, we don't even know what this word is. It's written like this, and the traditional commentators don't know what this means, so they break it up into fire and law, a fiery law. But it's not clear what that means or if that's the right word. But okay, just to make clear, we've got Sinai, God's coming from Sinai, then God's shining and appearing also in the lands of the brothers, cousins that we have that have been turned out of the covenant. Then there's a kind of coded reference to Moses's, the place of Moses's great demise. And finally, there's this like fiery law. Does anybody know what to do with this? Let's start to just sort of play with the language here. But this is the grand opening. God came from Mount Sinai and then went around and did all this other stuff. Anyone reading anything here? What's going on here? Too complicated, huh? Michal, thanks.
It just reminds me of that midrash where just taught like to little kids really often about how God went to all the different mountains and said, do you want to be the mountain in which I give the 10 commandments? And they, fight about how tall they are and how beautiful they are. And in the end, God chooses Mount Sinai. So it seems like perhaps what we can see is like came from Sinai. Maybe the order is a little confusing here because we would expect first to go to the non-Sinai choices and then end up at Sinai, but maybe it's in that vein where it's like here, this was an offering that could have gone in other directions, but ended up going in this one. We can't hear you.
How did I get muted? Okay, beautiful, beautiful. That's exactly right. Not in the sense that it's necessarily the right, but it's the right reference, because that's what Rashi does with this also, is to bring in, as Michal did, a kind of a legend from the Talmud in Tractate of Avodah Zarah that says precisely this. And as Michal says, sometimes we teach it to kids and it feels almost like simplistic in its kind of Jewish superiority. Like the idea is but it's rooted in a very deep question. And the question is, why did we get chosen? What's so special about us? Right? The Talmud asks this question, and one of the answers it gives is, no, it's not that we were chosen and nobody else had a chance, but actually God went around to every single nation and offered them the Torah, and they said, no, we'll not take. In fact, it's very snide language. It's like, well, what's in the Torah? And it says, well, thou shalt not steal. And they're like, no thanks, not for us. It's like very like triumphalist language, but that's a legend that if you read Rashi's commentary, he's going to do exactly what Michal did, which is to say, it sort of feels like God is going around to the nations. Like it's not clear that Sinai is the place, that we are the choice. And there is, whether you want to read that legend in, you do have this sense that like there's something, he gets the God of Israel, and yet not quite, right? Like it's a God that's sort of moving around everywhere, and it's not clear where God's loyalties lie, so to speak. Matt Silverstein.
Okay. I don't have anything big, so I want to talk about something structural. Normally, the poetry are two pieces. There's a thing and then a more specific. I forget the word. He shook and he broke.
Like a parallelism.
And he appeared. And this is four in the different order, because it's came, shown, appeared, approached. Came and approached and shown and appeared would double up. So there's something going on with putting all of this as one thing instead of two separate little pieces.
Ooh, I like that.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
I like that.
There's something there with that.
So Matt is saying very often we see parallelism, we have seen in biblical poetry, which would be something like AABB, right? Like idea, amplification of idea, another idea, amplification of idea. But Matt is saying it's actually, let's see if I can select here. I'm having trouble with my mouse. These two lines seem parallel. And then eternal came from Sinai and approach from Revivot Kodesh seem parallel. And there's a word for that also in biblical literary analysis, which is a chiasm, like a framing, so that there's a kind of like, well, they say so that in order to emphasize the middle, but actually in some ways it emphasizes the framing as well. In other words, Matt is wondering if there's a link between the Revivot Kodesh, the place that sounds like the place where Moses was damned, and Sinai itself, with a kind of like God wandering around to other places in the middle, okay? Okay, if you're confused, so am I. Like, we're really trying to make sense of a very wild set of references. Alexandra.
So I have a lot of thoughts, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep them straight in my head right now, but I'm looking at Eish Dot, and I'm really enjoying Aleph through Taf, and then Shaddai, and the Taf has like the shape of the Yud in the shape of the Taf. So like that, and this can go like in many different directions, but the idea that like the eternal light of God is everywhere, or an Aleph through Taf, like all of the alphabet, all of the possible resonances, manifestations of the divine in the world, and like the eternal light and the idea of the light unto the nations, and then
okay, I'm almost going to stop you there, just because you're doing such good work for us, but there's so much, as you're saying, there's just so much, like there's a lot of room here, and this word is unknown. It's not a word we can identify. So it starts to feel like the word is asking us to play around with it, with its form. The rabbis have done that. Alexander's doing that. Alexander notices it's the first letter of the alphabet, or the Aleph Bet, and the last. And then there's a name of God in the middle, Shaddai, right? It's like, and I'm sure Alexander could keep going, but if there's any other piece you want to add to that, I'll let you. But I just, in some ways, it's like the point is just that you can keep going. There's something, a fiery law. What is, or a fiery way? God has this fiery way in God's right hand, and God is going around and talking to everybody about this fiery way. And he's at Sinai, and God is at Paran and Sier, and also, and I have to start asking about this, and also the other place is some kind of coded, kind of veiled reference to the place where Moses was cursed. What is going on? God walking around with this fireball, right? Like, yeah, you want to add, Alexandra, please?
I wanted to bring it to like Moshe's experience and his punishment, as like he has to be held to this higher standard because his light, he's been trusted to give like this light, this fiery light to the people, but he did it in a way that was not of light. He did it in a way that was of like a human way to just knock things around. And so because he didn't do it in his, but he was above that. But right. I don't think it's an unfair punishment. I also think it's like he was spared seeing his people fight each other and duke it out in the land, and he didn't need to go to the land to be so spiritually elevated. He was already there.
Okay, I want to like thank Alexander, especially for always taking up God's cause, right? Like Alexander is sympathetic to God. Like we as Jews tend to be very like critical of God. That's our inheritance, right? And Alexander's always like, wait a minute. Let's not be so quick to judge the wisdom of the eternal. And that's right and fair. I mean, we don't actually know how to evaluate that. All we know is that this is a sad fate for Moshe. But we don't know how to evaluate what happened there. But what I did really appreciate about Alexander's description is that it's like Moses is holding the fireball. Moses is somehow trying to bring this thing, which is God's way, but it's fire. And so Moses screwed up. I mean, now I'm playing my role, which is being sympathetic to Moses, but Moses couldn't hold the fire, right? And maybe that's part of what's happening here, as Matt, as Matt suggests, and as Michal started us off wondering, God is sort of selecting. God sort of like some people are in and some people are out, and God's bouncing around, and there's like, who's going to be in and who's going to be out? Well, it turns out Moses is out, right? So there's a kind of national story, cosmological story, but there's also Moses' personal story that's sort of embedded in that, and it's all kind of a blur. Okay, one more thought on this stanza, and then we'll move on a little bit from Emil.
Could I jump in for a second? I mean, you don't know me, but
oh, you can, but just hold on. I've just called on Emil, so just hold on, and I'll come back to you. What is your name?
Okay, great, Sharon.
Sharon. Okay, we'll come back to you.
Yeah.
I was just going to say the rhythm, and the sort of mystery of it, like you really feel like Moses is dying and trying to remember like who God is and what happened and what does this all add up to. He's like, it's like these fragments of like there was a fire, and like something approached us, and like there was a king in Jeshurun, and like it's really moving, like it's really because it lacks all those techniques like we've talked about, like it's not shaped, it's not parallelism, and you feel, to me it's like you feel like Moses is really trying to make sense of like what happened to him, what has he seen, who are these tribes, what is their inheritance, and like the fragments of the language and the kind of mystery of it, is like really affecting, like, and it's like he's just trying to like sum it up and be like, I don't know what this is all added up to, but like the eternal came from Sinai, like he was the fireball, something happened, I did the wrong thing, I don't, like a lover of the people, the holy ones are here. It just feels like this kind of reverie, and sort of trying to, it's like trying and failing almost to sum up the Torah, really. Like it's all still a mystery. Like all these things have happened, and like I still don't understand anything.
That's great. I mean, I think you're exactly right, Emil. That I said this is beautiful language, and there's something about this rhetoric. It's strange because I'm pointing us to these kind of coded references and these sort of strange moments that Moses seems to be using to embed his own story or some other, but nevertheless, somehow he manages to cloak it in this like dun 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 dun, and God came, and now there's a king, and everything like this. It's a very in some ways, it's a very fitting, triumphant ending to the Torah here. Now I see that my computer is about to die, so I'm going to plug it in here. But let me call on Sharon. Are you out there?
Yeah. Okay. So I have a couple just very short things to say, but just about fire itself and about the fact that the burning bush was the beginning of this, and that Sinai also has the word hate in it, along with the word bush, just in the roots of the word Mount Sinai. So there is, from the very beginning, Moshe carrying a very, very big and very scary package that we backed away from, if you recall. And the thing about ascent and descent is so interesting. This came up last week. But when we think God is descending, ascending, he's really descending. We think he's descending, he's really ascending. And Moshe got caught in the middle of that, going up and down. And so, of course, he can hardly interpret. But fire and anger is there from the beginning. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, okay. That's an interesting link that you're making between Sinai itself. And I think the root of Sinai is not hate, because that would be a sin, but like
is in there, I think.
Right, but that would be there's a little different, but there's maybe a kind of homophone there. But
homophone, yeah.
But your point is, nevertheless, I think your point is strong even without the letter, because there's a way in which I think we can talk about Sinai itself as too much for Moshe to hold, right? Yeah. So there's this like there's this big moment that Moses had to carry, and it was Moses was alone, and it was dangerous, and it was that's the legacy that Moses is shouldering, and but then also in these little moments Moses is carrying the burden, and it actually ends up being ironic that Moses is punished for this tiny moment when Moses delivered on the grandest moment. Okay, now I want to just, before we leave this introduction, because there's one other piece that I think it's important to look at. This opening stanza is, kind of dizzying with all of its references. But Emil pointed us to towards the end, another grand statement here that has caused a lot of confusion in the history of commentary, which is this one. This is a famous line. Moshe commanded us a Torah. Moshe Torah tziva lanu Moshe. And then there was a king in Jeshurun. Vayhi b'Yeshurun melech. B'hitasef roshei ha'am, when the heads of the people assembled, or it might be when he assembled the heads of the people, the tribes of Israel together. So now here's a question. Who is the king? Like, what is Moses talking about? This all happened, and then there was a king in Jeshurun. When Moses gave us the law, the Torah that God had commanded, then there was a king. Who's the king? There's no right answer. The commentators debate this fiercely. Who do you think the king is here? Let's see some hands. Hands for God. Is God the king? That's a good answer. Jen's on board. What about, is Moses the king? Is that what Moses is saying? And then there was a king. I was the king in Israel. No. Famously, I think Reviewed Levi says it was the Torah. The Torah was the king. The message was the king. Do you like that answer? Anne likes that answer. Okay, I see some. All right. Those are some of the answers the commentators give. Any other answers? I should say there's a word we keep using here, Jeshurun. Some of you know the Shul B'nai Jeshurun. It's another name for Israel, sort of another way that our people has been known as the people of Jeshurun. Okay, that's if there weren't enough references swirling around. I think I just saw a hand. I see a hand. Anybody got a sense of who this king is? All right. Matt, you want to give it a shot?
I'm thinking of when the Torah scroll was discovered in the basement. Is that Hezekiah? Which king is that? I'm almost, when, the thing they discovered the Torah in the basement, maybe it's that king who found the guy.
Like
I don't know, because it feels drafted on.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, Michal?
It's Josiah. But I mean, that's the scholarly.
But that's not true. The scholars are wrong about that, I think.
Well, the scholars might be wrong about that, but what Matt is talking about, it's Josiah. And just from the scholarly perspective, really quickly, the vast majority of Deuteronomy is believed to have been this scroll that was found by the priests who worked for Josiah, because he was really trying to engage in a unifying project during a period of some turmoil, and he was doing it through this religious revival. So if you want to take the scholarly historical perspective,
and then that would mean what? What is the Torah saying here?
Well, it's a parallelism between Josiah and Moses, very, very clearly and deliberately setting Josiah up as a Moses figure for his own time.
Meaning what? What is this voice of Moses saying about Josiah?
It's saying, just as Moses was the leader who brought the people into the cusp of the deliverance, Josiah is bringing the people to the next stage of the deliverance through this religious through this religious Torah, this religious teaching.
Okay, then you would have to, if that was the reference, then you would have to read this voice of Moses as saying, there will be a king one day in Israel, and that will be Josiah.
Right, but well, yes and no, because again, this is all from a scholarly perspective. You take it or leave it as you wish. But
it's not. But my point, my point is that whatever the scholarly perspective is, we still have to read it back into this voice in Deuteronomy.
No, but it's often put into the future. In other words, why are there all these laws that very, very clearly show that this is coming from an established culture that has laws in place, but they're put into the future? It's because it was written retrospectively, as if it was written beforehand. Again,
it still just has to make sense. That's fine. It just has to make sense within the narrative itself. Also, we have to come up with a reading in Deuteronomy, whether it was written afterwards or not. So that's what I'm asking.
I was responding to Matt.
But okay, now we have to move forward a little bit. So I want also to take a look at one other section here in Moses's kind of farewell poem. This was his kind of great opening. But there's, I think, another important piece of this, and it's a long poem. We won't get to look at all, but there's another important piece to look at, and that is, take a look at the blessings that he starts to give. So he gives a blessing after this to Reuven, and it's very short. Okay, so when the blessings are short, you kind of know, like, the Torah's not digging in, okay? And then there's a blessing for Judah, and the blessing for Judah is also relatively short, okay? Which is interesting because in Jacob's blessing, the blessing for Judah was much longer. But now we move to the blessing for Levi. Okay, now what's significant about Levi? It's Moses's tribe, okay? Moses comes from the tribe of Levi. In fact, the first thing we hear about Moses is that a man of Levi went and married a woman of Levi, and they had a child, and that was Moses. Okay, so here is the blessing. And let me just before we take a look at this, take a look at the way it looks like in the blessing that Jacob gives to his children. So Jacob called his sons and said, come together, and he gives a blessing to Reuben. He gives a blessing then to not Levi alone, but to Shimon and Levi, and it's a terrible blessing. Shimon and Levi are a pair, their weapons are tools of violence. Let me not be included in their secret plans. Let not my being be counted in their assembly. For when angry, they slay men, and when pleased, they maim oxen. Cursed be their anger so fierce, their wrath so relentless. I will divide them in Jacob's, etc., etc. It's a bad blessing, and it's a reference to Shimon and Levi's kind of violent revenge against the assault of their sister, okay? So that's the blessing that Levi gets in Jacob's blessing. Now look at the blessing that Moses gives to his own tribe. Take a look at this. Okay, and of Levi he said, let your Tumim and Urim be with the man who was devoted to you, whom you tested at Massah, challenged at the waters of Meriva. Tumecha ve'urecha leish chasidecha, asher nisito b'Massah, terivehu al mei Meriva, who said of his father and mother, I will not see them. His brothers he was not familiar with. His own children he did not know, so that they would keep your words and guard your covenant. Ha'omer la'aviv u'le'imo lo ra'itiv, ve'et achav lo hikir, ve'et banav lo yada, ki shamru imrotecha uvritecha yinsoru. They shall teach your laws to Jacob and your Torah to Israel. They place incense in your nose and whole offerings on your altar. Yoru mishpatecha leYaakov v'toratcha leYisrael, yasimu k'torah ba'apecha u'chalil al mizbachecha. Bless, Eternal One, his strength, and favor the work of his hands. Smite the loins of those who rise against him, and let his haters rise no more. Barech Adonai chelo ufo'al yadav tirtzeh, machatz matnaim kamav, umisanav min yikumun. There's that language, by the way, for hate with the sin. Just so. Okay, so this is the blessing for Levi. Now, the Urim and Tumim here, these are references to the priestly garb and the kind of the jewels or the words that the priests would carry around with them. So that makes sense. The priests come from the tribe of Levi. But who is the man who was devoted to you? Who is the man that you tested at Massah and challenged at the waters of Meriva? Who is that? And actually, there's not an obvious answer. Is it Moses? Is it Aaron? Both? Right? Who is Moses talking about here? And then especially when Moses says, who said of his father and mother, I will not see them. His brothers he was not familiar with. His own children he did not know. so that they would keep your words and guard your covenant. Who's that? Who didn't know his father and mother? Who's not familiar with his brothers? What's going on here? Is this Moses? It's a reference to Moses? Alexander, what do you think?
I think it's Moshe, and I'm reminded of the mask that he had to wear to speak to the people in order so that he could speak to God without a mask. If I'm remembering, I know in the past I've mixed up when he wore a mask and when he took off a mask, but I think he wore the mask to speak to the people and took off the mask to speak to God. And he spoke to God in order to elevate the people. But in doing so, he had to like sort of hide who he had become through that probably, and wasn't able to really truly know humans the way most humans know each other. And so I think he's reminding them to try to keep in mind his teachings.
Okay, so this is good. So Moshe was someone who was always at a remove from the people. Moshe, in going up to Sinai, right, and coming back, Moshe was cut off, sort of the leader of the people, but really with no relationships to the people. Kind of known for not spending a lot of time with his family, wasn't raised with his family, right? So when Moses describes this son of Levi who didn't know his own, wasn't familiar with his own children, one wonders, like, what are you referencing? And how autobiographical is this? Len, Sharzer.
So I would agree. Yeah, I think this is Moses talking about himself, because I think this and Hazinu before it, Moses has come to the end of his life. He's not going to get to go into the land. There's a lot of sadness. There's a lot of bitterness. And he's saying, look at everything that I gave up to take on this responsibility. And whether it was his biological parents that he was taken away from in the basket, whether it was his adoptive parents in the palace of Pharaoh, he had to leave them. He had to leave his own children. He didn't, as you said, have the relationship with brothers. And this is what I've come to at the end. And he's worried that the people are going to leave the Torah that he's given him. He's worried that the people are going to adopt false gods. And he's saying, look what I gave up for you. At least think of that and think of me when I'm no longer here.
Think about this moment in Moshe's life. I mean, I think Len is tuning right into it. Moshe has, we just heard that he's once again gotten the reminder from God that he's not going to enter the land of Israel. He's at the end of his life and he's not going to get that final journey. And so it's time for him to say goodbye to the people, and he does so. And he composes this poem that's like structured on the blessings that Jacob gives, very elegant kind of form. And he's making some grand pronouncements about the people and the blessings that he wishes for the people and the inheritance that they receive. But in there, somewhere in there, he keeps talking about himself. Keeps talking, like when he says, you tested at the waters of Meriva, right? You challenged at the waters of Meriva. He even says you tested at Masad. That's an earlier challenge in the book of Exodus, right? And we've already seen a reference to Rivavot Kodesh, which echoed exactly the language that God used, Merivat Kadesh. So Moses is doing something complicated here. And we should expect that from Moses by now. He's a complicated guy. And he's saying farewell. He's offering blessings. He's trying to secure the mission. He's saying wonderful things about God and wonderful things about the Torah, wonderful things about Israel. But somewhere in there, he's also coded some response to this frustration that he has at not being allowed to enter the land of Israel after he gave up everything. He gave up everything. He didn't have parents. He wasn't raised with his parents. All of the nation of Israel are his brothers, but he didn't really know his own siblings, right? He didn't know his children. He didn't have time to spend with his children. He was completely devoted to the people. And this is what he gets. And that's in there. That's like, I am reading, and I think Len is also, that's like coded in there. It's this beautiful structure, kind of like elegant, another epic poem from Moses, but somewhere in there is just a burning bitterness. And it's a bitterness after I tried to hold the fireball, after I went up to Mount Sinai, I did everything for you so that I claimed this inheritance for this people. And I'm not going into the land of Israel? Who are you? All right, one last comment from Hannah Jensen.
I think it's so fascinating that one of the things I think that makes Moshe the leader that he is that he's so human in a lot of ways. And as much as he's closer to God than anyone ever was, he also had lots of flaws and he fell short a million times. And even early when we're introduced to Moshe, one of the first things that happens is he kills someone and then kind of runs away. Like that's one of the first things we know about him. And so I think it's really powerful, actually, that even in his last moments, he doesn't just leave with grace and with generosity and with saying, you know what, God, you're totally right. I shouldn't have hit that rock and I'm ready to go. He's still not ready. He's still struggling with surrender. He's still struggling with accepting that he's not in control. And that's all of us. And I think regardless, that is such a human understanding and experience, and this deep resentment, even though you know you shouldn't have it, even though it's not really your place. And so you just sneak in these comments along the way, because overall you're saying a lot of beautiful stuff and you're phrasing it really well, and you know you're going to die anyway, but you can't actually go without saying that last obstinate thing, because you're still just a person and you're still flawed and you're still just struggling to make sense of what you think you're owed somehow, or what you think you're entitled to after everything else. And at the end of the day, you're just not. That's not how it works.
So profoundly put there, Hannah. Moshe's like, what a character, you know? I mean, I just think he's the greatest character in all of literature, because here you have the guy who he's simultaneously the hero of the story, and also kind of not there at all. He's just a channel for God. He's hardly exists in a certain way. And yet he's the one who could be the channel. He's the one who had that inspiration. He's the one who led us through the desert. And this is the guy who will not be allowed in. And this hero, this sort of like our great teacher Moshe, ultimately is a tragic figure, right? Ultimately, we cry as Moses' story ends. And I think this poem has a little bit of it's not the moment to just lament his own life, but he can't quite not do it either, right? This last farewell days, it has all the blessings and has all the celebration, all the things that Emil reminded us, all the grandeur of a goodbye and here is your inheritance, but it also has these little coded references to how hard it's been to be Moses. And speaking of tragic figure, let's just end by taking a look at the actual end of Moses' story, which after all of this poetry, the last poetry that Moshe utters, Moshe went up from the steppes of Moab to Mount Nebo, and he looked across the whole land. And God said to him, here in verse 4, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will assign it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you shall not cross there. So Moses, the servant of the Eternal, died there in the land of Moab at the command of the Eternal. And now listen to this line. God buried him in the valley in the land of Moab near Beit Peor, and no one knows his burial place to this day. Right? Like Moses is gone. He's like poof, like almost like he was gone when he walked up the mountain into the clouds, right? And then he's gone. And he's our hero. He's our leader. He's the reason that we're here today. And yet there's something about him we could never fully access. There's something about him that could never fully access us, right? And we owe it all to Moshe. And yet in the end, you know, he's gone, and we don't know what to do exactly with his legacy. And I think he didn't know what to do with his legacy either. Right? And I think this poem has some of that. All right, let's end there tonight. We will, this is the end of a certain cycle, but we will meet next week to look once more at at one of the first poems that we looked at, the first great poem that Moshe utters, the Song at the Sea, and we'll look at it now in the context of Passover. So great learning with you all. Good to see you tonight.
Rabbi, may I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
It really struck me as you read that Moses goes up the mountain to look across, but he's not buried at the top of the mountain. He's buried in the valley.
Yeah. It's a little mystic, like how exactly that happens. Not like so clear. And and is it God that buried him exactly, or like who buried Moshe?
You said God buried him.
Well, I translated it as God, but it says, and he buried him. And he buried him, which we assume to be God, that's in the context. But yeah, there's something very deliberately mysterious. If you were confused by some of the mystery in this poem, don't worry, because I think it's fair to say the Torah is being deliberately a little opaque here at the end. And part of that is that the desire almost is to blot Moshe out. The desire is almost to like have him just fade away in a mist rather than to like really end his life as a human being does. So anyway, lots to keep thinking about. I'll see y'all. Good night.